I've been playing a lot of Battle.Net 4 this year, both on stream as well as in my free time. And although the Monosoul runs that I've been playing are interesting, playing Battle.Net 4 repeatedly can be a bit monotonous, which makes sense since that's also the biggest complaint people have about that game. So I decided I'd mix things up a bit and do a limited folder run in Battle.Net 5 instead. Sadly, Battle.Net 5 doesn't have the Double Soul patch cards that Battle.Net 4 has, so I won't be able to keep using one Double Soul for the whole run. Instead, I decided to limit my folder to chips that fit a specific theme. In this case, I'm turning Mega Man into a proper soldier, using only chips that would make Colonel proud. Now, since I am playing Team Colonel and using a folder with chips that are based on Colonel's theme, I will be letting myself use Colonel Soul. But the catch is that I'm not limiting my chips to Colonel Soul related chips, since that would limit me to just null and obstacle ones. Rather, I decided to take a slightly different route in this run, one that would make both Barrel and Uncle Sam proud of my firepower. But before explaining the rules of the run, I'll insert the shameless pandering section of the video here and ask for my presumably well-deserved likes and subs. I focus on Mega Man Battle.Net content as well as some Pokemon Nuzlocke, so if those are things you're interested in, this channel could be one you'd enjoy. I also plan on branching out to other Mega Man titles in 2025, especially the X, Zero, and ZX games. With the sub begging out of the way, let's go over the rules for this run. So the main idea in this run was to take a theme befitting of Colonel and use that theme to limit my chip folder. Seeing as Colonel is an army rank and Barrel himself was the supreme commander of Netopia's network corps, hold on a second. Charlie was an ace helicopter pilot in Netopia. Wonder if they know each other. Yeah, I'll keep that in mind for another time. The point for this video is that Barrel and Colonel are soldiers, so I figured I could limit my folder to chips I feel they would use, specifically ones where the chips are similar to actual weapons of war. So this means that my chip selection can be broken down into three categories. The chip is a gun, the chip is a cannon, or the chip is a bomb. I expected this to make the run a slight challenge since I assumed I wouldn't have that many chips to work with, but boy was I wrong. For cannons, there's the obvious three levels of cannon chips, but there's also Tank Cannon, Mark Cannon, and Magnum. Now I'm not arguing over that last one, the Basher viruses in Battle.Net 3 are giant cannons. For guns, there's Circle Gun, Searchman, and Vulcan, which is a realistic enough weapon for me to include it. Lastly, there's bomb chips, including Mini Bomb, Energy Bombs, which I clearly won't be using, Crack and Parabombs, Black Bomb, Time Bomb, Boy Bomb, Mine, Gyro Man since he drops bombs, and the big bad bomb himself, No, I'm just kidding, it's a Napalm Man. I kinda hate that I have to include him. That's just a bit too real, in a bad way. You'll notice that there's quite a few Navi chips from Team Proto Man, so yeah, I'll have to make another video discussing that topic. Barrel and Chod really had their teams mixed up. But anyways, you might have also noticed that I didn't include Numberman or Colonel's chips in my list. That's because 1, Colonel's chip is a sword, not a gun or a cannon, and 2, Napalm Man is better than Daze Bomb anyways, we've got our Encode Navis covered already. Now, before I start explaining every single detail about every single fight in the game, I'm going to just let you know now that if you've seen my Battle.Net 4 Monosoul runs, the layout of this video will be just a bit different. Rather than discussing each segment of the game one by one, I figured it'll be easier for this run to just talk about some key points. Namely, I'll be discussing the folder and the chips I used throughout the run, how liberation missions went in the run, and the endgame segment. First, let's talk about the folder we used throughout the run. Among the wide list of chips mentioned in the rules, our early folder has a decent number of them. We get to start with Cannon, Vulcan, and Mini Bomb, and we get access to Mark Cannon immediately in AC/DC area, so we're off to a solid start. We can also get access to the High Cannon E and Vulcan 1C chips in the AC/DC 2 shop, so we have some decent firepower early on in this run. And lastly, before the first liberation, we can find Cannon Star and Vulcan D in the main comp 1 screen mystery datas, giving us a solid folder overall for the first mission. After that first liberation, we get access to the Orin 1 shop, which contains the Mine P chip, and more importantly, the Circle Gun chip in the C code. This is great since there's no other chips that we can get in this section other than more cannons and high cannons in codes that we don't want. Plus, we're going to be seeing a lot of the C code in this run, so having Circle Gun this early is perfect leading into Liberation number 2. Then, after the second Liberation mission, Pixies finally opens, giving us access to Vulcan Star in his bargain bin. Orin 2 also opens up, which has a blue mystery data containing Vulcan 2C. And of course, access to Scilab area means that we could fight Katak viruses to get the tank cannon, which sadly doesn't come in the C code. But that's fine, seeing as a good chunk of chips we currently have are already in that code anyways. Oh, and remember how I also mentioned that the Gyroman chips are an option in the rules? Well, for this run I decided to use the patch cards to get access to the Team Protoman Navi chips, but only after beating the Liberation mission in which those Navis join the team. Since the Gyroman joins the team for Liberation number 3, I can now use the Gyroman chips in my folder. We can also get to the End Area 1 now, where the shop contains Vulcan 3L as well as M Cannon G, which shares a code with the Gyroman chips. Clearly, those are going to have to go into the folder. And of course, once we finish Liberation number 4, we get double the good news. We can now use the Napalm Man chips, which honestly were the single most important ones in this run. Although the folder I've been using up until now is fairly strong, it does have a big flaw. The problem with the majority of the chips that I have are that they are single target chips, which makes it a pain to delete groups of viruses. Circle Gun can hit multiple enemies, but only if they're within 4 spaces of each other and only on the outer panels of their area. But with Napalm Man, I now have the ability to deal 120 or 150 damage in a 3x3 area, making it much easier to delete groups of viruses. Napalm Man also shares a code with Time Bomb, so I decided to add both of these chips into my folder. Ultimately, these are the chips that make up my folder for the rest of this run. The key chips here were Circle Gun, which shares a code with Crack Bomb, Gyro Man, which shares a code with M Cannon, and Napalm Man, which unnecessarily shares a code with Time Bomb. High Cannon was also a staple in my folder throughout the run, but sadly didn't share a code with any other chips. The same goes for Tank Cannon, which I do end up using towards the end of the run. And of course, I held on to Cannon and Vulcan in the start code because they're in the start code. So, the next topic to discuss is the bread and butter of Battle.Arc 5, the Liberation missions. And I'll be honest, this section is gonna go by pretty quickly. Liberation 1 goes about as you'd expect, with a plethora of early chips and Colonel's charge tag doing enough damage to get me through that mission. Starting with Liberation 2, things got a whole lot easier. Circle Gun was a crucial chip that could help get one-turn deletions on viruses since it can hit more than one virus at a time. But, as I said earlier, Circle Gun can't always hit every enemy on the field, and we gotta remember that the mini-boss style enemies do have more than 100 HP, so I did still need to rely on my other chips as well as Circle Gun. Speaking of the mini-boss enemies, the Gyroman chips are actually really effective against them. By holding the L and R buttons while using the Gyroman chips, he'll drop multiple bombs on a single target rather than carpet bombing the entire row. This deals a ton of damage to the mini-bosses, clearing most of them out with a single chip. Gyroman is of course also effective at taking on the Nebula Navis at the end of each of the missions for the same reason, but there's another benefit to using these chips as well. It turns out that the number of bombs Gyroman drops is equal to the number of panels your enemies have in that row. Since you'll often have a smaller area to work with in Liberation missions due to being surrounded by dark panels, Gyroman will oftentimes hit 4 times instead of 3 times. Turns out that the Gyroman chips are ridiculously good in Liberations. And of course, when Liberation 5 came around, it ended up being a much easier mission than it should have been, all thanks to the inclusion of the Napalm Man chips into the folder. Doing up to 150 damage to all enemies on the field made taking out viruses quick and easy, so I'm glad I was able to use those chips in this challenge. And yet, I can't say that every Liberation was a walk in the park. Liberation Mission 6 was the one where I finally started having some trouble, and it all came down to the presence of a single enemy type. Dominards. These things are the absolute worst enemy in the game. Dominards attack by teleporting onto your panel, which in and of itself isn't actually that bad. The real issue is the fact that they're shielded while on their side of the field, which means that my circle guns and my Navi chips can't do anything to Dominards. So whenever Dominards do show up, I had to just hope I'd be lucky enough to have my high and M cannon chips instead of my circle guns and Navi chips. This does actually cause me to fail to liberate panels in a few instances, all because I didn't have a way of doing enough damage to Dominards. Seriously, I hate those things. So overall, Dominards in Liberation 6 were the only thing that made these missions difficult or tedious in any way. Even when I had to face the Nebula Navis, they weren't actually too difficult to take on. As I mentioned in the folder section of this video, the chips that I had available to me were actually really good, with some of them sharing codes, letting me generally pick at least 2 chips together in a turn. But we do need to keep in mind that the 3-turn limit for liberating panels in these missions also applies to fighting the mission's boss. And if you don't end up defeating the navies due to the 3-turn limit, and your phase ends after you've used all of your navies, the Dark Lords do end up healing before the start of their enemy phase. This does happen at least once in a run, and it was a bit of a nuisance, but that's all it was overall. The folder had more than enough firepower behind it to make each Nebula Navi in the game easy enough, even if it required more than one of my navies to defeat them. Now, after finishing Liberation Mission 6, all that's left is to take on Nebula in their home base. Unfortunately, this is where all the deaths in the run occur, but don't worry, I'm not the one that died here. Rather, each of my teammates died while we were going through Nebula's base. Jokes aside though, I actually hadn't experienced any deaths in this run up to this point, most likely because I don't have to deal with the stupid HP bug that I have in my Battle 4 runs. This one felt really nice to play, honestly. We're also at the point in the game where I can finally use a double soul. Since this is a Colonel inspired folder, I can finally get access to Colonel Soul, which I can activate by sacrificing the time bomb chips that I have in my folder. I'll be honest, I'm usually not a big fan of Colonel Soul. I find its obstacle chip requirement a bit strange, and its arm change ability is useless on its Chaos Unison. Still, this run was an opportunity for me to try out Colonel Soul and change my mind on it. And after trying out Colonel Soul with this folder, I have to say, I was right about Colonel Soul. Arm change is one of the weakest abilities I've seen in a double soul, and wasn't worth attempting even with a folder full of M cannons and tank cannons. The charge speed of your arm cannon is much slower than the normal charge shot on Colonel Soul, and I even lost a Giga Cannon when I activated arm change with it, not realizing that I was about to run out of Colonel Soul. So yeah, Colonel Soul, really disappointing, and I stopped using it pretty quickly. But after getting past all the Nebula Navis without that stupid 3-turn limit, I finally got to move on to the finale, battling against Nebula Grey. And let me tell you now, fighting against this guy was the worst experience of the entire run. See, just like Duo and Battle 4, Nebula Grey's area is missing the back 2 columns of panels, which means that any chips which need panels to work are completely nullified here. This means that I couldn't use some of my best chips, including Circle Gun, Napalm Man, and unfortunately, Gyro Man, which I did try using since I assumed that it would work. I also can't place time bombs on his side of the field, as they disappear immediately. So without Napalm Man, was I really gonna use time bombs anyways? Of course I did, that's how I found out that they don't work. So after changing my folder a bit, I took on the final boss, and the first attempt went about as well as expected. I took too much unnecessary damage due to being rusty in the fight, and foolishly tried using Colonel Soul's arm change during the fight. The first fight is also where I learned that the Gyro Man and Time Bomb chips don't work against Nebula Grey, which means I had worthless chips just sitting in my folder. But I still managed to do some decent damage, and moved on to attempt 2 after changing up my folder a bit more by putting the Giga Cannon Program Advance in there. On my second attempt, after Nebula Grey cracks all of my panels, I messed up by putting myself in a position where I couldn't dodge his Black Prominence attack, so I ended up taking way too much damage again. Getting hit by a Dark Sword also doesn't help out much, so once again I ended up losing the fight and had to go for attempt number 3. This time, I did much better at dodging his attacks, not taking any damage until I managed to get him down to about 1400 HP. At this point, there was a lot of back and forth, with me taking hits throughout the fight, but dealing damage as well. I also want to point out that I was using recovery chips in here, specifically Recover 200, because soldiers do get medics, right? And at the end of the fight, when Nebula Grey cracked all my panels, I put myself in the corner where his Black Prominence attack wouldn't be able to hit me. But unfortunately, Nebula Grey ended up using Dark Meteors, which I now had no way of dodging. I righted up a Giga Cannon Program Advance, but with no way of avoiding the damage, it was time to move on. But his meteors didn't actually delete me. I had enough iframes to survive at 1 HP with Undershirt, so with his flame coming back into the field, I fired off one last Giga Cannon, winning me this run. I've got to admit, I had a lot of fun with this run. The folder was much stronger than I had expected, and I still had plenty of decent chips to fight Nebula Grey with, even if I couldn't use some of the best ones for that fight. The folder was also more than good enough to help me get through liberation missions without any issues, so overall I'd say that the folder was a huge success. It's just a shame that I didn't have any reason to use Colonel Soul at the end of it all, but what can you do? Colonel Soul just isn't that great. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like and let me know what you think of Colonel Soul and the chips I used in this folder. And if you enjoy Mega Man Battle Network, please subscribe to my channel for more content. My next run that I'll be doing will be the Battle Network 4 Number Soul only run that I've been procrastinating for a while now, so look forward to that one. And as always, thanks for watching.